Okay, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Hofstra University webinar on immigration policy priorities in 2021. I'm Gregory DeFreitas. I'm a professor of economics at Hofstra. I also teach labor studies in our labor studies degree program, and I am director of our Employment Research Institute, the Center for the Study of Labor and Democracy. The center is one of the organizers of this event, and we're delighted to have collaborated with the Labor Studies program, with the Political Science Department, with the Center for Civic Engagement, and also definitely with our frequent partner, the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center. Today we have a two-part event. We're starting off with a more policy-oriented session, and then we invite you all to drop back in at 4:20 today for the migrant experience, ecologies of migrant care, which will have speakers from Stony Brook, Dr. Lori Flores, and also Pablo Dominguez Galbraith from Dartmouth, and it will be chaired by our own director of the program, Professor Benita San Pedro. I just want to say a few introductory remarks and then step out of the way and let our speakers start talking. The first speaker today will be Dr. Rosanna Perotti, who's the longtime chair of our Poli-Sci department and also an expert on immigration policy. She'll start us off today. Then she'll be followed by Muzaffar Chishti, who is a senior fellow at the increasingly well-known Migration Policy Institute based in DC, but he's actually a lawyer, and he's at NYU Law, where he's in charge of the New York base of MPI. And I want to direct your attention to the chat room because there's a couple of articles there by Muzaffar Chishti, very recent articles about the new Democratic plan for immigration that's just been introduced in the House of Representatives. And then finally, we have Elise Castillo, who's going to be speaking third. She is a graduate, we're happy to say, of Hofstra Law, and we're very proud that she went on to become director of the very well-known Refugee Center based in Hempstead, CARECEN, the Central American Refugee Center. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Perotti to lead us off. And please hang on to your questions for all of the speakers. I mean, you can send them through the chat, and then we'll definitely allow time at the end for going through Q&A. Dr. Perotti.
Hi, let me screen share. Okay, can that be seen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Greg. Thank you for inviting me. And I just want to say I'm grateful and honored to be with our guests today. I'm so grateful that they've joined us today. I'm going to speak from prepared text because I want to stay within my time limits, but say a whole lot of stuff. With a new president and congressional majorities come new expectations that the United States will be able to devise a more coherent approach to the complex, delicate set of policies that together determine who we will become. Will we legalize those in the United States who are undocumented? Will we finally clear up backlogs in the asylum system? Will we finally clear up and maintain border enforcement, change the balance of family reunification and skills-based legal immigration? Will we create a more robust system for integrating immigrants in our society? The prospects are daunting. Comprehensive immigration reform has been an elusive political goal requiring bipartisanship, broad participation by stakeholders, and a commitment to cooperation, all very difficult in our polarized political environment. But the need to fix our broken immigration system is very great. Immigration continues to be a force for vitality in our economy and in our rapidly aging society. It's a strategic resource, providing the United States with comparative advantage in the world economy. Some 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States are settled here and live in mixed citizenship status households. Public opinion broadly allows these residents to become part of the above ground economy and society. And at the same time, our borders must be secured with reasonable, enforceable restrictions. The last major legislative reform of US immigration policy occurred in 1986. The Immigration Reform and Control Act. Congress sought to open the front door to legal immigration and to close the back door of undocumented immigration. For the first time, IRCA made it illegal for employers to hire undocumented immigrants, but it sweetened the pie of that enforcement provision by allowing undocumented people who had been in the United States for a long time to come out of the shadows or legalize their status and become permanent residents. IRCA allowed a special legalization program for undocumented agricultural workers to help Western growers. And it gave authorized immigrants protection against discrimination on the basis of alienage, lest employers refuse to hire them because they looked or sounded foreign. I want to point out here that IRCA was a bipartisan piece of legislation. It was backed by President Reagan, who was a Californian and a supporter of guest worker programs, Alan Simpson, Republican senator, Democratic members of Congress, Peter Rodino and Romano Mazzoli, Democratic Senator Edward Kennedy, and indeed the Republican and Democratic parties were both split over immigration. IRCA set the template for what people mean when they use the words comprehensive immigration reform. It paired restrictive measures like tougher enforcement with liberalizing measures like an amnesty for undocumented people already here in the United States. Like the Immigration Act of 1965, IRCA was a wholly bipartisan effort. Nearly 3 million undocumented people were legalized under IRCA's legalization provisions, allowing many of the undocumented to avoid exploitation on the job, to get driver's licenses, to purchase homes, to achieve greater economic integration and mobility. But it continued to be difficult to require employers to verify their employees' documents. Once again, the numbers of undocumented immigrants in the United States grew, and Congress imposed further restrictions on immigration in 1996. Congress tried several times to revisit the issue of comprehensive immigration reform in the early 2000s. President George W. Bush made immigration reform a second-term priority, and in 2006 and 2007, with his support, negotiators in Congress, including Republican Senator John McCain and Democratic Senator Ted Kennedy, crafted a bill that would have paired increased border security and workplace verification with a variety of more liberal measures, including 400,000 legal temporary guest workers and paths to legalization for those who are undocumented. But the House, still controlled by Republicans, passed a bill so heavily restrictionist that it provoked immigrant marches across the country. The House and the Senate were unable to reconcile their differences, and Congress failed to even come close to a comprehensive immigration reform. When Democrat Barack Obama became president in 2009, he too promised a comprehensive immigration bill. The following year, the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives did pass a bill creating a long-sought legalization for dreamers, for people who were brought to the United States undocumented as children. The measure failed in the Senate. Then, in June 2013, a bipartisan gang of 8 Senate negotiators, including Democrats Chuck Schumer of New York and Republicans Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, John McCain of Arizona, and Marco Rubio of Florida, tried again to put forth a comprehensive measure that would have created a guest worker program, along with adopting tougher enforcement measures, such as workplace verification. The Senate passed this comprehensive immigration bill, but the House, now filled with even more hardline immigration opponents, refused even to discuss this measure. Because Congress was unable to enact comprehensive immigration reform, four things happened. First, states and local governments took it upon themselves to enact immigration restrictions. And here we see reminders of two places where that happened in Hazleton, Pennsylvania and Arizona in 26 and 2010. Secondly, a dramatically strengthened immigration rights movement arose, fueled by young immigrants, particularly dreamers, putting pressure on government at all levels for a more responsive, humane immigration policy. The third result of Congress's inability to pass comprehensive immigration reform was the overwhelming emphasis on enforcement. This started with George W. Bush's administration and continued through the Obama years. Each of these presidents increased spending on border security and invested in the miles of fencing along the nation's southern border. Both of these presidents also turned to interior enforcement. Fourth and related, Congress's inability to pass immigration reform led to a unilateral executive actions. In 2012, following the failure of the DREAM Act, President Obama issued an executive order creating a new program, DACA, which provided temporary residence and work eligibility for some 7,000 people brought to the US without documents when they were children, provided protection and work eligibility for them. The idea was to do what Congress had been unable to do, to provide a backdoor to legalization, or at least a chance thereto. The Trump administration offered an immigration reform package for Congress in 2019. It proposed slashing the percentage of legal immigrants who come to the United States under family reunification from 2/3 of all annual admissions to 1/3. The administration also sought to create a new merit-based legal immigration system that prioritizes job skills and knowledge of English, something along the lines of the system used in Canada. But far more relevant was Trump's tsunami of executive actions on immigration. The Trump administration began building new wall along the southern border using diverted Defense Department funds. It imposed a ban on most immigrants and travelers from Iran, Libya, Somalia, North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen, Kyrgyzstan, Myanmar, Eritrea, Nigeria, Sudan, and Tanzania. It prioritized deporting undocumented immigrants, seeking more and faster removals. Trump pursued criminal prosecutions of all border crossers, leading to the separation of families. The former president dramatically limited eligibility to apply for asylum, seeking, among other things, to send asylum seekers to Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador to make their claims. A Trump-era regulation enabled federal officials to deny permanent residence to immigrants who have used social safety net programs, such as Medicaid and food stamps. The administration dramatically reduced the admissions of refugees into the country from a 110,000 target set by President Obama in FY 2017 to 18,000 for FY 2020. It increased vetting and obstacles for legal immigration to the United States, including increasing the number of interviews required for applicants. It ended temporary protected status for hundreds of thousands of people from El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras, Nepal, Nicaragua, Sudan, and Liberia. It reversed the deferred status for childhood arrivals, the Obama-era program. None of this came as any surprise to those who listened to candidate Trump in 2015 and 2016. What's counterintuitive is that the doubling down on enforcement came at a moment when undocumented immigration to the United States was becoming more complex and requiring more nuanced policy. Border apprehensions have been declining when President Trump came into office, not increasing, with visa overstays exceeding illegal border crossings. The nature of migration over the southern border was changing from predominantly young Mexican men seeking jobs to Central Americans, increasingly unaccompanied children, and families seeking refuge from violence. Increasingly, undocumented immigrants had set down roots in American society. A complex set of challenges requires a complex, comprehensive set of policies, a set of policies that can win broad support and that reflect our history as an immigrant nation. But this sort of an agreement is increasingly elusive for at least three reasons. demographic change, partisan polarization, and continued unilateral executive action. The US population is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, of course. Minorities make up about 37% of the US population today, and the US Census Bureau predicts that given current birth and immigration rates to the United States, non-whites will make up more than half of US population in 1960, as we see in the first part of this diagram. 2/3 of Hispanics and 90% of African Americans typically vote Democratic in presidential elections, while whites vote about 60% Republican. As the proportion of minority voters increases, it is expected that so will a segment of the US electorate that votes Democratic candidates. The foreign-born share of the US electorate is growing. A larger and larger proportion of immigrants to the United States have been coming from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And this has been the trend for a very long time, since 1965. Partisan polarization will also make immigration reform difficult. As we've said, immigration only recently became a partisan issue in the United States. Before the 90s, immigration was a cross-cutting issue. Support for liberal immigration and for restrictions cut across the parties about equally. From the 90s until about from the 1960s until about the mid-90s, Democrats and Republicans routinely supported restrictive border enforcement programs. And Republicans like President Reagan and President George W. Bush even supported generous guest worker programs. But since the year 2000, both the Democratic and the Republican parties have become more polarized, as you can see by this diagram. Republicans tilt on all issues in a different direction from the Dems. More restrictionist, the Republicans are more restrictionist, the Republicans are more liberal on immigration today. Business, the Republican Party's key supporter, until recently, is now not so interested in supporting immigration as it was many years ago. Today, it's easier for businesses to relocate to where labor is cheap than it is to hire cheap labor in the United States. Labor unions, key Democratic supporters, have become more ethically diverse and more concerned with advancing a pro-immigrant, pro-immigration agenda. One final reason it's hard to find consensus on immigration in Congress is that presidents have undermined any possibility of congressional action by issuing executive orders on immigration without input from Congress. DACA and the Muslim ban are examples. In recent years, Trump would issue an executive order, pro-immigrant groups would challenge the order in court, and Democrats would become so angry they pulled back from any tendency to compromise on enforcement measures. There are Democrats and Republicans in Congress who would like to change the asylum process, enact legalization for dreamers, change the legal immigration system, and perhaps even fund barriers. Democrats are not completely opposed to enforcement, and many Republicans would like to have Congress play a larger role. But the constant barrage of executive orders made it difficult for congressional negotiators to gain any footing. All of this has been taking place amid an environment in which globalization has created unprecedented economic inequality. Right-wing populist leaders all over the West have targeted immigrants as the cause of low-wage workers' problems. And yet Americans are becoming broadly more supportive of immigrants and immigration. When Gallup asked Americans in 1986 if immigration should be kept at its present level, increased or decreased, 49% of Americans said it should be decreased. And when the same question was asked in June 2018, only 29% said it should be decreased. Asked in 2019 whether immigrants strengthen the country or are a burden, 66% said immigrants strengthen the country, double the percentage in 1994. Similarly, 2/3 of Americans today say it is very or somewhat important for most immigrants in the country illegally to remain here legally, according to Pew Research. 73% say it's important to take in refugees escaping war and violence. There is partisan polarization on these issues, to be sure, and most Americans continue to express concern about enforcement. What does this portend for Joe Biden's success in getting immigration reform and change? On his first day in office, President Biden began reversing some of the Trump executive orders. The administration has loosened many of the Trump era restrictions on applying for asylum, which you'll read about, which one of our panelists has written broadly about. Biden sent to Congress the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, seeking an 8-year path to citizenship for some 11 million people, stepping up border technology, imposing higher penalties for employers who exploit undocumented workers, and increasing funding for immigration courts. Biden ended the Remain in Mexico program. He has appointed a family reunification task force to address the families torn apart by Trump's zero tolerance policy. But the challenge will be enormous to dismantle an estimated 1,000 Trump era changes that transformed our immigration system, some say gutted our immigration system, without triggering a surge of arrivals at the southern border. Much of this will have to be done through executive branch action, but Congress will have to act to bring us closer to a set of policies that will better reflect the importance of immigrants to our economy and our tradition. Thank you.
Great. Muzaffar.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you to all of you who have gathered to listen to this on a bright day like this when you could be doing better things. So my task here is essentially, I think, to very nicely follow what Rosanna laid out for us in a very, I think, interesting and very effective way about the context of where we are today in the politics of immigration. So, let me just begin with the obvious, kind of the elephant on the Zoom is Trump. I never get tired of saying that Trump was the first president who campaigned and then got elected and then kept his promise on the issue of immigration. It was his calling card. He used it unabashedly and used it with aplomb. And that is an important political fact, I think, in not just in modern, but I think in historical context also. So that was the backdrop in which the 2020 election happened. Joe Biden was one of the odd 25 presidential candidates running in the Democratic Party. Joe Biden by nature is a moderate. He's a pragmatist. He arrived in the initial debates on the stage for the primary contests as a moderate. And he was also sort of stuck with the legacy of Obama administration, in which he had been the vice president, had been an important ambassador to Central American countries to look at root causes of immigration, and was sort of having difficulty defending Obama's record, which many advocates had branded him as deporter in chief. These were all backdrop things happening. And what happened slowly is that the closer the primary got to its final election, he became more and more progressive on immigration. You could say that other candidates drifted him in that direction, and the party was moving in that direction. So it became almost untenable for him to be anything but very progressive on immigration. And if you looked at his campaign, that reflected that. So we arrived, and then he became president, which a lot of people may not have expected, but I think the fact that he had moved on immigration significantly sort of provided an important turning point. So, but I think many of us were quite surprised, frankly, those of us who work closely with people in the Biden campaign, as to how much he led with immigration. And immigration is an important issue, obviously, but it doesn't go up high like climate change and joining the World Health Organization again, or the WTO. But he made it a point to make it one of the most important sort of signature issues of his administration very early on. We knew that he was going to issue executive orders with a certain amount of regularity in the beginning, but he decided to issue about 1/3 of them related to immigration on day one, which did not just include, as Rosanna hinted quickly, of lifting the travel ban, issuing new priorities on immigration enforcement, making a promise to end the public charge rule, including the undocumented and the census, all there. But he then, on the very first day, pushed a very important agenda, for immigration in the form of his proposed bill. And that whichever way you look at that bill, it is certainly the most dramatic advanced political agenda on immigration anyone has put out in more than a generation. And so that got notice. He was going to he was going to lead with immigration and not be scared to lead with immigration. That was frankly a huge change, certainly not only from Trump, but from President Obama as well. And I think in this process, he had decided that he was not only going to unwind Trump, and you saw the good slide from Rosanna about how many of those policies by MPI's count, about 400 important executive actions that President Trump had undertaken. He was not only going to unwind Trump, but he was going to go beyond unwinding Trump. So you could say, building back better could be used as one of the cliches here, that I not only want to unwind Trump, but I want to focus on issues that have been elusive for 2 or 3 decades. And that's what the imprint you saw on the very first day of his administration, which were then followed by a series of other executive orders in a couple of weeks later, which have not now sort of given us an idea about where the Biden agenda is going to be. Now, let me just quickly say that he said that at the border, we're going to change policy and reverse the Trump era of forcing everyone out of the country and sort of recommit ourselves to our obligations under international law. In the interior, under the Trump administration, we had essentially made everyone a priority for removal in the rest of the country, that he was going to go back to establishing priorities in immigration enforcement. Those are 2 very important sort of decisions which affect the people in their lives. And then this bill, on the legalization, which, as some people call it, the whole enchilada, was the big surprise. And, let's just quickly talk about the whole enchilada, that it would legalize 11 million unauthorized people in the country. It would clear the backlogs in our both family and employment-based immigration over the years, and would not have that much of a component of enforcement, which, as Roseanne pointed out, is a departure from the older view of comprehensive immigration reform, where a big enforcement package was always seen as an important part of what could make something a possible compromise package. And I think here he stayed away from that, knowing that there was a lot of resistance to it from the base. That base has been saying that we have had it with enforcement, that in the past we have gotten only enforcement and nothing else in return. So that was part of the narrative with which I think he was approaching it. But it did not include any provision about increasing future flows of immigration, which, we don't have time to talk about now, glad to talk about in the question and answer, is a flaw. That unless we increase legal avenues for people to come, we will come back to this issue of illegal immigration, even if we clean the slate of the 11 million a few years from now, because the laws of supply and demand are going to require US workers to come and need a job in the US economy. So that's one of the failings of the Biden proposal, but it's obviously a bold initiative. And let me tell you why it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for 2 or 3 fundamental reasons. First, we're in the middle of the biggest health crisis in our history. The first year of this administration is going to be completely taken over by the pandemic, including the economic downturn from the pandemic. And the economic downturn here has relevance to the immigration debate, because it's very hard to say that 11 million people should be added to the labor market as a legal force when there is such high levels of unemployment in the country. Second is that we are still in a highly polarized world on immigration. Even all the efforts that Roseanne put out on the slides for us, they were highly bipartisan efforts. Top leaders of the Democratic Party were involved in those. Even they did not pass. So this is sort of where the the hope meets with experience very quickly. We have been here in 2005 and 6 and 7. We have been here in 2013, that even with strong bipartisan support, these things have become very hard to pass. Let me just remind all of us that the Kennedy-McCain bill, which everyone celebrated, did not even come for a vote in Congress. Though we all have been sort of saddled with the notion that that was a great moment of bipartisan effort. And as Roseanne pointed out, the last Gang of 8 bills didn't even get a hearing in the House. So that, the history of big bipartisan bills have not changed. And unfortunately, filibuster still remains intact, that for any bill to pass, you need 60 senators. That means you need at least 10 Republican senators to go along. And that is still a hard sell. And last thing is that as long as Trump remains somewhere lurking in our politics, immigration is going to become sort of the red meat at every rally of his. It's not surprising that even at the first appearance he has made since his departure from DC, he again led with immigration. As I kind of like to say that in immigration rallies, it's like at Trump rallies, talking about immigration is like, you can't have a Billy Joel concert without singing The Piano Man every time. That's sort of how it plays in the Trump rallies. And that has really not changed. And that goes sort of to the very important point on partisanship that Roseanne made. One of the charts that she showed you was how about the country actually has become much more pro-immigrant in the last 25 years. We have never been more pro-immigrant in our public opinion polls than we are today. But the chart that she didn't show, which is actually another Pew chart, so it's a competing organization of MPI, not ours, is that even though the country as a whole has become highly pro-immigrant, the division between the Republican and the Democratic Party has become much wider. Today, it used to be almost equal between people who thought, Republicans and Democrats who thought well or poorly of immigration. Now, the difference between Democrats and Republicans on immigration is like about 45%. So if you're a Republican, you become soft on immigration. The only thing you do is invite an opposition for you in the primary, which is really where the Trump factor comes in. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Therefore, if the big enchilada is not going to happen, I think efforts will be to do something smaller. We just call it the kind of the smaller bites at the apple. And in fact, strangely here, President Biden himself has almost but said that he doesn't expect the big enchilada to pass, that he expects that small measures will be introduced and they have more ability to pass in Congress. Now, 3 of the candidates for this, these are sub-bite, these are the dreamers, whom you all know who they are. That people who have had TPS, agriculture workers, and now what has been introduced into the political bloodstream more, and we have contributed to it, is that maybe there is a room to look at essential workers. That the pandemic taught us anything is that the immigrant workers at the front lines, at the high end, both in terms of keeping us at home so that we could keep working at home while others are delivering food and making food and harvesting food for us, and the front lines of the healthcare sort of fight against it. That if there is a pandemic relief, there's an argument to be made that essential workers should be included in that. As I like to say lightly, you can't be essential and deportable at the same time. Therefore, if not in a full enchilada, at least we should be able to provide some protection to people who are providing us with relief while we sit at home. And this is a large number. If you use the broadest definition of an essential worker, that's pretty close to about 5 million people. So if Congress decide to just take small bites at it, there are candidates for this. And 2 bills will be introduced, will get a hearing in the House next week, both on the Dream and Promise Act, which includes TPS people and dreamers, and an agricultural work bill. And we hope that after that, there'll be essential workers. And the last thing why it's hard to do anything with the big enchilada is what's happening at the border. And let me just spend a little minute on that. I think any administration does not like any possible specter of a huge deluge at the border. President Biden himself warned early on that he cannot expect, cannot have the ability to have masses of people arrive at the border. So we have been hoping that they don't. We have been sending messages that don't come. You won't have a huge welcome. But messages from politicians in DC, in my experience, have never affected the flows of people coming from danger and corruption and nepotism. So people have started coming. They thought at the end of Trump world will be the beginning of a welcoming mat in America, despite the signals from DC. And the numbers are going up. By all indications now, February of this year will be the largest month of February for child arrivals. And we believe about 7,700 people of the kids will be at the end when we do the count will have come in February. That's not the highest in the peak, but highest February in recent times. And one of the reasons why these numbers have gone up is that the Biden administration kept in place one of the most important Trump era policies on border, which was to use a health rule called Title 42 to expel anyone at the border without regard to any process. We have kept that in place, even this administration thinking that would send a signal for people not to come. But we created an exception for kids, that kids will not be expelled at the border with Title 42. And guess what happened? Kids came, and kids have started coming in record numbers. Again, the point is, no matter what you say, pull factors in the United States are always critical in the driving forces, people coming to the border. They read a signal and they march to it. And the reason the Biden administration is having difficulty with accommodating this new group of people coming in, and these are mostly kids, is that the Trump administration has essentially demolished any capacity for welcoming and treating these kids because they had put in place the era of expulsion. So all these places where you could welcome kids, send them over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, essentially were dried up. So this administration is doing catch up with trying to find a decent place for kids to stay while they're being treated. So what it's doing is essentially, after a few days, releasing them into the country, finding their sponsors, and adding them to the backlog of the immigration courts, which is already at 1.3, which will obviously get bigger and bigger. So I'm not sure that what problem that's going to solve, and that may be one of the things that the Biden administration will have to deal with. Biden administration has put its faith in one thing, that it should address the root causes of immigration in the Central American countries. And that sort of comes naturally to President Biden, because as I said earlier, he spent a lot of time towards the end of the Obama administration in negotiating with Central American countries to address how we could provide aid and other relief to those countries to address root causes of immigration. They're placing a lot of bets that that is actually going to yield results. I think we have known that from experience, important though those measures are, it's very difficult to produce real concrete outcomes when people are desperate to leave their countries. So this is still something that we will have to sort of watch. One quick thing on interior enforcement, where there's good news, that the President Biden has only been in office 50 days, that the number of arrests in the company have gone down hugely. They have gone down 60% last month from the time of Trump administration. So that will be 1/10 of the highest levels in the Obama administration. So that part is really, I think, doing quite well. And let me conclude by saying two things which are really nothing to do sort of with the Biden push, but are very important pieces of news for immigrants, and have happened in the last 50 days. One is not noticed that much in the stimulus bill that the Senate passed, and we hope that Biden will sign. There is a provision for kids in mixed families, mixed household, where there is one parent who is unauthorized. These kids have been ineligible, even though they're U.S. citizens and have valid Social Security numbers. They have been ineligible to receive any stimulus package in the prior bills. They will now be eligible to get that, and that's 2.2 million kids. That's a huge number of kids and a huge relief. And I think another point that did not get enough attention and happened only yesterday is that the Biden administration has finally abandoned the public charge rule. This was a very difficult thing to negotiate. Many of us were in these conversations as to how to end this, because if you wanted, this was a rule issued by the Trump administration which would sort of make it very difficult for low-wage immigrants to come and get green cards in the US. That should we issue a new rule, that may get challenged. They did something really elegantly yesterday, and I was quite impressed. They just decided that they were not going to fight a lawsuit by advocates against a challenge to the rule. And they will therefore let stand an injunction that was given by a federal district court in Illinois, which is a nationwide injunction against the implementation of the public charge rule. That means the Trump rule is not in effect and the old public charge is now the rule. So this is, I think, really good news. And even though some of the big things may not happen, I think smaller things, I think, are beginning to make a change in the lives of people. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We're beginning to get some student questions, so I invite other students to send your questions in the chat room. But our next speaker is Elise de Castillo from CARECEN. Please, Elise, go ahead.
Greg, thank you so much. Thank you to Hofstra for inviting me to join you today. Thanks to everybody for being in this webinar. I think that in times like these, it's so important to really make sure we have a lot of people at the table and different voices in the conversation. And it's really encouraging to me as an immigrant advocate to see so many people who are interested in a topic that is, very relevant right now and fundamentally an important issue for the future of our country. And thank you in particular to Rosanna and to Muzaffar for having set the stage as eloquently as you did. You left very little meat on the policy bone for me. So I'm going to try to take this conversation down from the kind of broad, high-level policy perspective and move it down to how it affects our communities here on Long Island. Give me 1 second as I share my screen with you. So as Greg said, my name is Elise de Castillo. I am an immigration attorney, proud Hofstra law grad, I won't tell you when, and the executive director of CARECEN, which is the Central American Refugee Center here on Long Island. And for nearly 40 years, CARECEN has provided direct legal services, community education, and advocacy to immigrants on Long Island between our 2 offices in Hempstead and in Brentwood. And as our name indicates, our roots are very much in helping Central American refugees who are fleeing the region after civil wars in the Northern Triangle back in the 1980s. And we're still around to tell the tale because we have been able to adapt our organization to the ever-changing needs of Long Island's immigrant community. So now we have clients from over 70 countries worldwide. But over the past 7 years or so, we've really returned to our roots in that a large portion of our legal services has focused around representation for Central American refugees, primarily children and adults with children who are fleeing Central America. So that's what I'm going to focus on a bit today is what do asylee and refugee issues look like in the context of our Long Island communities. And a big part of that is kind of as both Rosanna and Muzaffar have teed up is undoing Trump's immigration legacy. It will be no surprise to any of you that practicing immigration law over the past 4 years has been living in a constant state of heightened anxiety. It has been dealing with the constant whiplash of all of the changes, policy, law, rules that have come down from the federal level, the ensuing litigation that has paused those changes, the ensuing litigation after that has brought them back. And as difficult as it's been for us as immigration practitioners, it's been even more difficult for the clients that we serve because the Central American refugees that we represent are fleeing, as both Rosanna and Muzaffar have indicated, very real danger, violence, and hardship in their countries and are coming to this country to seek protection, as is their right under both US and international law. And they have, for the past 4 years, seen the doors to that protection summarily shut in their faces. So it has been very, very challenging for our community. And I guess one of the questions you guys will ask is, well, why are we looking specifically at Central American refugees? Although Long Island's immigrant community is very diverse in terms of countries from which immigrants come, the majority of immigrants, or the highest number of immigrants from any country on Long Island, come from El Salvador, and the other Central American countries are not far behind. So in terms of our Long Island community, when we talk about refugees, what we're primarily talking about is folks from Central America. Now, there's a very key distinction that we need to make kind of at the outset, is the distinction between refugee and asylee. You guys are going to hear me use these terms somewhat interchangeably. Understand that there is a distinction between the two, but this distinction is largely procedural. Refugees are individuals who apply for refugee status abroad, are granted their protection while they're abroad, and they enter the United States as refugees. And the annual refugee cap, so the number of refugees that can enter the United States in any given year, is set by the president. And as my co-panelists have discussed, there has been a big shift in refugee caps over the course of the past 10 years or so, with numbers, I think it averaged about 76,000 over the course of the Obama administration, to Trump set the cap at 15,000 in October of last year. Biden is looking to bring it back up, but I'm jumping ahead. We'll get to that in a second. Conversely, asylees apply either at the border or at the interior of the United States, and the protection asylum is granted while the person is in the United States, and that status is granted either by an immigration judge or an asylum offer, depending on how it is that the person applied. And there is no annual cap for asylees, which is a distinction from refugees. So what does it take to become an asylee or refugee? The bar is extremely high. You don't just come to the United States and say, I don't want to go back to my country, or I'm afraid of returning to my country because it's dangerous. It's actually very difficult to be granted either status as a refugee or asylum. But fundamentally, what a refugee or asylee has to prove in order to be granted their status is the same. And what that is, the person has to show a well-founded fear of persecution based on one of 5 protected grounds, which are race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And what does this look like for the folks that we work with here on Long Island? More specifically, who are Central American refugees? The Central American refugees with whom we work are largely families or children fleeing El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, which are havens for gangs and violence. There is no immigrant monolith here. Not all immigrant stories are the same. Not all asylees and refugees are fleeing the same types of persecution. But I think that we can, to a certain extent, paint with a somewhat broad brush with folks from Central America, because the experience of folks in the Northern Triangle countries are very similar in terms of the dangers that they face, primarily from gang violence in their countries. I so clearly remember back in 2013, I was working for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as a consultant, interviewing Central American children who had been detained by the US government at the border and were in shelters in the United States waiting to be released to sponsors in the United States. And we were trying to learn more about the push-pull factors that both Rosanna and Muzaffar had discussed a little bit. What is it that motivates Central American immigrants, particularly Central American children, to come to the United States? I was sitting across the table from this beautiful young girl from Western El Salvador. She's about 15 years old. And I remember that she said to me, before she left for the United States, her mother took her to a local clinic where she received the birth control shot. And I asked this young woman, well, she's not a woman, a young girl, why it is that her mother had made that decision. And she said, well, my mother realized that the trip to the United States is a very dangerous one. And she recognized that I faced a very high risk of being raped on the way to the United States, and she wanted to protect me. I'm talking about this almost a decade later. There are goosebumps all over my body as I remember this moment. And I think that any of us can put ourselves in the shoes of that mother and stop and think about what it would take for you to put your 15-year-old daughter in a position where you feel that she is likely to be raped. And to me, it was very clear that she realized that the danger that that girl faced by remaining in El Salvador was greater than the danger of being raped. And so again, this is not every Central American immigrant has the same story, but I think that the story of this young woman is very indicative of many of the stories that we hear on a daily basis of the very real dangers that the Central American immigrants do face and what motivates them to come to the United States looking for protection, as is their right under international and domestic law. So how did protections for refugees and asylees change under the Trump administration. This is not going to be a surprise to anyone. There was what can only be described as a systematic dismantling of the refugee and asylee systems. I've only been given 15 minutes. I've already eaten up about 7 of them, so I'm going to get through these really quickly. We could spend an entire week talking about all of this, but I'm going to give you what I think Muzaffar would refer to as the bites of the whole enchilada. This is a different enchilada, though. There was a reduction in the number of refugee admissions to the United States. As I mentioned, in October of last year, Trump set the refugee cap at 15,000, which is a decrease of tens of thousands from his predecessor. And there was also a complication in slowing down of the refugee application process, moving resources away from the refugee application process in the exterior, creating procedural complications in applying for refugee status that made it more difficult for individuals abroad to access the refugee system. A whole bevy of changes to policies, to rules, and to practice that made applying for asylum and establishing eligibility for asylum and refugee status more difficult than ever. Right? My co-panelists talked a bit about some of the different rule changes, some of the different executive orders that we've seen over the past 4 years, but that have really, really decimated our humanitarian and immigration system with a particular look at asylum and refugee status. I think one of the most troubling things that we've seen over the past 4 years is the impact of prejudicial judicial appointments and judicial decisions. And what this means is that as most areas of law, although immigration law is codified, it is also shaped by judicial decisions. And so over the past 4 years, there have been judicial appointments both to immigration courts and to the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is our appellate body, that have really shaped eligibility for asylum. And the problem here is that judicial decisions have long-reaching implications. Judicial appointments are long-term appointments. So this isn't something where we have President Biden come in and all of those Trump appointees are going to leave. They're going to be part of our immigration court system for years and decades to come, and will continue to shape our asylum process, even under different, more pro-immigrant administrations. Another one of the really challenging judicial impacts over the past 4 years, there's a mechanism by which attorneys general can refer certain cases to themselves for review. And we very famously saw, particularly former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, refer a number of asylum cases to himself that basically he didn't like. They granted a lot of protection, in his opinion, a lot of protection to asylees, made it possible for many individuals to apply for asylum. And so what he did was refer those cases to himself and really rewrite the decisions on them and change dramatically eligibility for asylum for hundreds of thousands, I would argue, of potential asylees, with a very particular impact on Central American asylum seekers. So 2 policies that we've seen over the course of the past 4 years that have been particularly horrendous, to use a strong term. One is the migrant protection protocols, with both Rosanna and Muzaffar have mentioned. I put protection in quotation marks because I would think that this is more adequately described as the migrant persecution protocols. It is what has been known as Trump's remain in Mexico policy. So as you all now know, an individual has the right under law to come to the United States and apply for asylum. But under what is called MPP, individuals at the border were essentially turned back. That's fine, you can apply for asylum, but you have to do it on the other side of the border. And you can think about the implications of this. From a very practical level, US immigration attorneys are by definition on the US side of the border, right? So this policy limited asylum seekers' ability to access counsel that can help defend them in their asylum claims. And we've seen that the defining factor in the vast majority of asylum cases is the access to counsel. So if you're denying immigrants their ability to access counsel on their claims, it is almost a foregone conclusion that the claims are not going to be successful. Beyond that, it forced migrants to remain in Mexico, some of them in camps, what have been referred to as tent cities on the southern side of the border, others outside of these tent cities, but forcing them to live in squalid and dangerous conditions in Mexico for months and years. An additional policy that we saw in the past 4 years that is thankfully now defunct is the family separation policy. And this was enacted back in 2017 as an intended deterrent to Central American migrants. So what would happen is a parent with child, let's say, arrives at our southern border and indicates that he or she wishes to apply for asylum. The US government would separate that child, the parents, from their children. And the hope was that word of this was going to get back to Central America, and that Central Americans would say, I would rather stay here and face this danger with my child next to me rather than seek protection in the United States, having my child separated from me. Again, luckily this policy has been ended, but over the life of the policy, we saw more than 5,500 children, some months old, separated from their parents. And as recently as last month, more than 620 of these children, or 620 of these parents, still haven't been reunited with their children. So I think this is one of those moments where we can celebrate the end to very detrimental, very anti-immigrant policies, but we have to understand that the implication of these policies are very far-reaching and will take years to undo, and some of them ultimately may not even be undoable. But I'm ever the optimist, so let's talk a little bit about what my co-panelists have already discussed, is the changes that we anticipate under the Biden administration. Right? Muzaffar discussed the immigration reform bill that we have in front of us now. Rosanna did a fantastic job of setting up the challenges to getting immigration reform passed in the United States. But President Biden did unveil the US Citizenship Act on his first day in office. And again, as my co-panelists mentioned, the fact that he came in making immigration a front burner issue, I think telegraphs a very strong message to the US populace and to the immigrant community that immigration will continue to be a priority for President Biden over the course of the next 4 years. And were we to see the US Citizenship Act become law, it would provide protection to millions of undocumented immigrants in the United States. We've also seen strengthening of humanitarian programs, protections for Dreamers and for the DACA program. As recently as Monday, an expansion of something that is called temporary protected status, which as of this week will give Venezuelans who are currently in the United States the ability to live and work legally in the country for 18 months with the possibility of extensions of the program. And President Biden has also signaled his intention to raise the refugee cap. So going from 15,000 under Trump at the end of last year to over 60,000 is the proposed cap that Biden has presented. As I discussed on the previous slide, the end of the NPP program. So immigrants who are enrolled in the Now MPP program are beginning to be processed into the United States as of about the 19th of last month. This is going to have a very real impact on our communities here on Long Island, because what this has done is created, a group of approximately 25,000 immigrants who have been kept on the Mexican side of our southern border for months and even years. And now we're having all 25,000 people processed into the United States over the course of the next, some folks say weeks, some folks say months. The process is very disorganized, so it's really hard for us to gauge. But looking at past immigration patterns, what we on Long Island anticipate is over the next few weeks or months, we could be seeing anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 of these MPP arrivals coming to our Long Island communities. And you can think about the impact that has, not just on the legal services community, but these are immigrants who are coming with very real needs for food, for housing, for medical care, with a very particular set of needs around mental health services. And so this is something that our communities here are already starting to strategize around, because we want to be able to proactively respond to the very particular needs of MPP arrivals. And finally, the Biden administration is taking a very comprehensive look at the policies and practices that have been implemented over the course of the past 4 years. As Muzaffar indicated yesterday, we got news that the Biden administration was not going to continue the litigation on the public charge rule. And this is just one out of many of the policies and practices the Biden administration is going to look at and hopefully begin to reverse so we can return to a more humane, we'll keep it at humane immigration system, something that returns us to where we were prior to 2017. So I am ever the optimist, and I'm about to go against every optimistic bone in my body. Under the Biden administration, the future looks brighter for Central American refugees. However, it is going to take years to begin to undo the harm that has done over the past 4 years. And as I mentioned previously, some of the harm that is done, I genuinely believe will be irreparable. I am hopeful that little by little, we will get back to an immigration system that views immigrants as humans, values their contributions to our country in terms of economic contributions, in terms of social contributions. But again, as my co-panelist did a wonderful job of laying out, this is so much more than just an immigration issue. This is an issue of politics, right? The elephant in the room, as Muzaffar said, this has become the kind of core political issue in our country over the course of the past 5 years. And as long as it continues to be something that polarizes us as a country, it's going to be difficult to be able to reach any sort of system that can really bring us back to where it is that we want to be as a nation. So that said, I think I will wrap it up. And Greg, I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We've been beginning to get a number of questions. Let's see in the time remaining if we can hear from some students. Sarah Baum, if you're there. Sarah, could you please read out your question to the panelists?
Yes, let me just scroll back to it. Okay, here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So my question, this is to any of the panelists, really, I think any of them could speak on it. Despite Biden's hardline rhetoric against kids in cages, he recently reopened a child migrant detention center with a prolific history of abuse. Was this justifiable in your opinion? Is it a bad sign for immigrant justice activists?
Anybody want to take that?
Well, I mean, let me just, I do think that this is where this classic case is what Biden inherited for Trump. I mean, listen, even if kids come to our border and we have all intentions of following both our domestic and international law, processing them is not easy job. I mean, these are very difficult things to do, especially in the middle of the pandemic. You can, in the middle of the pandemic, there are certain distancing requirements that you have to place and pay respect to. There are requirements under various, judicial orders that you can't keep kids for more than a certain number of hours. And they just didn't have any capacity. I mean, I think it's true that they were not expecting this level of deluge that quickly. So I think it has taken them a little time. They have now opened 2 facilities, both in Kearns and Delhi, to turn them into, which traditionally have been the family detention centers, to turn them into kid reception places. Just imagine if you had to deal with this challenge in Long Island. It's not going to be that easy to put the switch on and off, especially when there has been nothing left on for 4 years. So I think it has taken them a little bit of a catch-up time, but I think they have finally decided to do something which may backfire, is that instead of trying to keep these kids at the border, to release them to a sponsor in the middle of the country. They will be coming to Long Island, to Chicago and Los Angeles, and be released to sponsors, and then add to the immigration court system backlog, where they may not see their cases done for years. So that's sort of the plus and the minus of this.
I think that's right. And I would add one more piece. there's more to housing children than just where we're housing them. It's also the rights that we're affording them. I wish I had the YouTube clip for all of you to see. I'll encourage you to take a look at it later. There's a very famous video of a Trump administration official stating that it was defensible to not provide immigrant children under the custody of the United States access to basic hygiene, toothbrushes, toothpaste, right, clean clothes. And I think that that is as we look at the difference between the Trump administration, the Biden administration, understanding that there's a lot more to it than that. I absolutely agree that the Biden administration has been in place for less than 2 months. The lights have been turned off for 4 years. It is going to take time to strengthen the system for receiving immigrant children at the border the way that it was when I was working with the UNHCR back in 2013 under the Obama administration. But there is a level of humanity that we are seeing in the treatment of children at the border that has been absent for the past 4 years. And I think that that can't be, it's impossible to overstate.
Okay, related to that, Imani has a question. Imani, are you there? Can you read your question?
Yes, I'm here. So on the slide on changes that were made under the Biden administration, I saw that an increase in camps was one of them, and I just wanted to know how that is a humanitarian or a humane effort.
Imani, can you restate your question? So you're saying that under the Biden administration, there have been camps. Is that what you're asking? Or the Trump administration?
If you could go back to the slide that with the 4 quarters, there was under the humanitarian efforts an increase in camps with the bill. So I was wondering how that is a humanitarian effort. No, I'm talking about refugee camps. It said refugee camps, did it not?
Okay, sorry, I heard camp. So you're asking about, so restate, can you restate your question for me one more time, please?
I did say camps. It said refugee camps, right? Or caps.
Caps. So the maximum number of refugees that we will allow, that we will receive in the United States or resettle in the United States in a given year.
Oh, okay.
So no, refugee camps would be a whole nother situation, refugee caps.
Okay, thank you. Erickson Velasquez, can you read your question?
My question, well, it really isn't a question. It's more just like a statement regarding to the last panelist's presentation. Refugees who expected to be admitted to the country after Biden proposed increasing the admissions cap have been turned away after the administration failed to make it official. And Biden's administration has not withdrawn from court cases former President Donald Trump was pursuing to keep immigrants out of the country.
Okay, let's see what the panelists have to say about that. Thank you.
So Erickson, thank you for the comment. I can't speak directly to refugees who've been turned away. I think that that's it's an interesting fact, and I will have to look into it. So I can't speak to that specifically. I don't know if one of my other panelists or co-panelists can. In terms of the Biden administration, in fact, it has withdrawn from litigation that limited immigration to this country as recently as yesterday. The Biden administration indicated that it was going to cease to litigate the public charge rule, which would have dramatically affected legal migration to the United States. I think that maybe what you're talking about is the fact that there are so many different cases right now winding their way through the court system around the different Trump era immigration rules that we have not seen responses from the Biden administration on all of them, but we have on some. And I think that the decision from yesterday to cease to defend the public charge rule in court sends a very strong signal that the Biden administration is going to continue to cease to defend other similar types of litigation.
Okay, anybody else want to say a word on that? Good.
I'm going to
What's that?
defer to the attorneys here.
Okay, I have a question for all of you, actually, if I could. I think Muzaffar mentioned the issue in terms of course, the critics of immigration always talk about the danger to the labor market, to American workers, and Trump claims that that's a big concern of his. But in fact, the AFL-CIO just came out in support of the Biden proposal, the U.S. Citizenship Act. And they've been in the news because, as you all probably heard, late yesterday, the House approved the PRO Act, which is like the #1 priority of unions and would increase labor union rights so that it isn't next to impossible to form a union in America. So what do you think about that? Is that surprising to you that the AFL-CIO, which of course is kind of the umbrella group for most unions in America, would come out in support of such a progressive immigration proposal?
And you start and I'll chime in.
Yeah, I'll just say that it's not surprising to me at all, because I would expect the AFL-CIO to be supportive of worker rights broadly. And what you know and have taught me as an economist is that broadly, immigrants, there's no evidence that immigrants are bad overall for the economy, quite the opposite. Although in narrow places, indeed, there are corners of the labor market where individuals may find themselves competing with immigrants.
Let me just add nuances. I mean, as you know, Greg, for sure, and I cut my teeth in the American labor movement, so my background to immigration comes from that. And AFL has over time changed its policy on immigration radically, I would say, and that's to do with the change of the labor force and the union membership. That the unions that are growing these days are unions in the service sector of the economy, and they are hugely immigrant labor forces. So for labor movement these days, including the AFL, to be anything but very strongly pro-immigrant would be to shoot themselves in the foot. And that's been kind of reflected in the union's policy over the years. The difference, and one of the reasons why that is true, is that they do see legalization as a way to get people out of the shadows so that they could then be able to organize them, which is hard for them to do these days, even though they are pro-immigrant. So that provides an important sort of leeway for them. The difference is that the AFL-CIO is not in favor of increasing immigration in the future, increasing pathways for immigration. And that comes in the way, unfortunately, of what a comprehensive plan should look like. Before, as I said early on, unless you increase pathways for legal immigration in the future, we're going to have another nucleus of unauthorized immigration a few years down the line. And that doesn't solve the problem. So AFL may support existing people in the country. They are still very skeptical about support for future immigration.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from one of our speakers this afternoon at 4:20. Pablo, could you please state your question?
Hello, yes, thank you so much. This has been an amazing panel. I've loved the discussions, the presentations, and I was just wondering, I will just read the question that I just posed here, but I am a Mexican, and in the last 2 decades, we have seen the expansion of the militarization and securitization of our borders and the borders south of Mexico, following the example and agenda of the US. In the last 6 years, Mexico has deported more Central Americans than the US per year, and has opened more deportation centers and employed more National Guards as Border Patrol and police than ever before. In most cases, Mexico has followed the threats and deals that the US has offered, whether with a Republican or a Democrat. The US is doing an offshore effort to have the nations south of their border do the dirty work of impeding refugees and migrants to legally seek asylum in the US. How is the new administration tackling this issue and changing this trend? What would be the best way to apply a regional solution to the humanitarian crisis that implicates us all? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone want to try to answer that?
I think that Muzaffar talked about that in his presentation. the immediate focus that the Biden administration has placed on working with sending countries, even though we recognize that the pull of immigration is so great, but this has been lacking for the past 4 years, concentration on what sends migrants to the United States.
Well, I mean, I think the dance with Mexico is still a very delicate one. We do know that the Trump administration, I think that's the force of your question, was essentially Trump outsourced good part of our immigration enforcement to Mexico. We asked them to police the borders with Guatemala and also to, in the context of MPP, to keep people who normally should have been treated here. We have, frankly, don't know what the final outcome of the U.S.-Mexico relations under this is going to be. We know that there was a phone call with the president of Mexico last week in which immigration was the subject for about 70% of the call. And I think we all know the facts that if Mexico does not provide some kind of mechanism as a buffer between Central American and US, and obviously people have different views of what that should be, we will have a much bigger number of people arriving. So using Mexico, I think, will remain an important part of this Biden administration's agenda. I don't think it'll be the like that it was in the Trump, but still will be an important force. But I think they are putting a lot of faith that if we have a combination of giving a lot of aid on root causes, we process some people for refugee treatment in the countries of origin. We had begun to do that for kids under the CAM program, that we want to increase that so that people don't make the treacherous journey. If they have an asylum claim, we hear it there. If they have a relative they can join with here, we may be able to bring them on a humanitarian kind of a parole. And then that, look, this is not just the United States' problem, that this is a regional problem. All the countries in the region should take part in this. And I think the signal they have sent on this is that part of the border czar at the White House is not a border czar, it's a diplomat. It's our former ambassador to Mexico, Roberta Jacobson, sort of acknowledging that you can't just look at the border just as a militaristic thing. You have to look at this in diplomatic terms. And I think those are some of the signs that they're really trying to send. How much they will yield results, we don't know as yet, but at least their effort is in the right place.
Okay, I think we're going to have to end it there. We've got some interesting dialogue going in the chats about ICE and the numbers of deportations and so on. So I invite people to take a look at that. We obviously have a very engaged audience, which is wonderful. I want to thank the speakers so much. I've learned a lot, and I hope our students and the rest of our audience has as well. And hopefully, again, everybody will come back with us at 4:20 for the second session this afternoon. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again to our speakers.